gracious enough to come back again. So I'll let everybody finish signing in.
Yeah, the suspense bills for that one. I need cash on top.
Suspense for today?
Yeah, no, for the garage.
Oh yeah, for Jai? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the cash, how you get cash?
Well, I can imagine.
Thursday is the 20th, right, that we're talking. So he's gonna do it 7.
I'm sure we'll have a few people coming in. I know a few students have told me that they're taking quizzes right now and then they're gonna come on in, so they will be a little bit late. But I wanna thank all of you for coming to our third ESRM 2017 speaker series, and actually our fourth. This is our fourth one today. And I am extremely excited today, I say that when people are coming today, to have Dr. Tony Orme here today, and his wife, Dr. Amy Orme, over in the corner. Tony was my advisor at UCLA, and so my love of geomorphology and coastal processes, it's your fault, taken me to the Santa Clara River mouth so many years ago. And it was just an extraordinary experience at UCLA. One thing though is class size. Some of our early classes there, I remember my California geography class, I had 400 students in my class. And way up somewhere with Dr. Logan, trying to see and hear what was going on, because we didn't have PowerPoints with slides at that time. So as much as I loved and missed UCLA, I really loved this campus and the small size of it. And the fact, although I'm looking at people I don't know, but the fact that I know, we for the most part know all of our students' names, which is really cool. When you don't come to class, we know it. So you cannot fall through the cracks like you would at UCLA at times. So without further ado, I want to introduce Tony and talk about some of his background. And it was very gracious for you to come out today and see us and talk about coastal processes. So he was educated in England, got his PhD in 1961, and taught in Ireland for about 8 years, and then moved on to UCLA, for which I am very thankful. He retired from teaching at UCLA in 2010, but he continued to be the director of the UC White Mountains Research Center, which many of you in the class have experienced it in my water resources management class. So it's a pretty amazing facility relative to our small Santa Rosa Island research facility. The White Mountains is huge, but they both have their own personality and charm. Ranging across much of geography, his published works include coastal, fluvial, aeolian, and tectonic geomorphology, mass movement, biogeography, climate change, coastal and watershed planning and management, and historical geography. His research is encompassed in Europe, Africa, North America, neighboring seas, which foray into the Caribbean, Middle East, and various East Asian islands. So Tony has been so many places. I remember, I think when I was still at UCLA, we were talking about going to Somalia at that point.
Yeah.
That didn't happen, did it?
I went 3 times.
Oh my gosh. We're glad you're here.
Yes, was shot at too.
Oh my God. Well, that's another story we'll talk about. He has published on dynamic geomorphology, historical conversion towards modern practice, and a lengthy piece in physical geography on the past 500 years of physical geography. He's also written or contributed to many books from Ireland, Africa, North America, and South America, to the lead volume of Foundations in Geomorphology, published in 2013. And he's presently evaluating the scientific and artistic merits on a 13-volume series on the Pacific Railroad surveys of the American West in the 1850s, which for a fluvial geomorphologist is incredibly exciting, because it was with the railroads that we suddenly could see what landscape really looked like when you came out to the west and you didn't have vegetation covering up all the cool geomorphology instead. He received several awards from the American Institute of Planners for a shore zone plan on Lake Tahoe in 1972, Distinguished Career Award in the Association of American Geographers, and Distinguished Emeritus Professor Award from UCLA to a fellowship for the British Society for Geomorphology. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Nice to see such a large audience. I mean, I'm retired. I don't see very many people anymore. My wife. She sees me, I don't see her first. But anyway, it's very nice to be here in this lovely room, this lovely campus. I must say, I mean, once it gets out, you're going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to hold students out. It's wonderful. Today, I want to titillate you for an hour or so, perhaps a little longer, on the California coast, and particularly on the changing coast. And does anybody know where this picture is? Well, it's not very far away.
I want to say Big Sur, but I don't know.
It's the western end of Santa Cruz Island.
We should know so much.
And it kind of captures some of the essence of California coast in a sense that is less disturbed than other parts of it, and with inhabitants who are less disturbed and so on. But anyway, my perspective today is to talk about the changes to the coast over time and address rates of change. We're very interested today in rates of change, not least on topics such as sea level change and how fast is it rising, if it is rising. Some politicians wouldn't want to agree and so on, but nevertheless it is mostly rising, not everywhere. I want to focus it really in three groups of topics. One being the long-term change, those that become observable over 1,000 years or more. That's the top category there. I just call it here arbitrarily long-term change. Of course, in that category are geological changes that due to tectonic shifts and so on that go on for millions of years and so on. They're observable sometimes overnight and sometimes observable over very long periods of time. And then the medium-term change from, say, 10 to 1,000 years. These are changes that you might observe during your lifetime, if you're alert, if you are not, and so on. Nevertheless, they are creeping up on you. And these kind of changes relate often to sea level change. And then the shorter-term changes that anybody who goes down to the coast, of course, can observe more or less continuously, work of waves and currents and tides and so on. And of course, you're ideally placed here to do some wonderful work, as I know Linda has done in the past, and Kiki as well, and so on along the California coast. And I'll finish off with a few comments about coastal management and the challenges it poses. Some of it's somewhat staggering in a kind of absurdity sense, but nevertheless, I just want to add a few things. This is a personal trip as much as anything, not a, it's kind of based on the work of many who have toiled along the coast, offshore, and in the watersheds feeding the coast. But I give it my own perspective and so on. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't even have to understand it, I suppose. But basically, I want to kind of titillate you, as I say. So there we are, the changing California coast. Now, if we want to look at changes, what do we go to? What kind of evidence do we use? Well, in California, we are fortunate to have had a fairly thorough survey of the California coast in the 1850s, shortly after California became a state. There were earlier surveys of the coast by mariners and so on, but their maps were often imperfect, and for some of them, important though they seem to have been to history, like Francis Drake, for example, we haven't got a clue where they were, and nor did they, it seems. But from 1850s onwards, when so much was happening in California, the map on the top left, of course, is a coast survey representation of what the coast of the Point Reyes Peninsula looks like, particularly Drake's Bay and the Limantour Spit and so on. Many of you may know it at that time. Now, you can't rely on the accuracy of old maps, but the Coast Survey did good work for the most part. Later, we have, of course, a whole succession of aerial photographs. I just threw in one here that I happen to have, and it doesn't show too much change. Yes, it shows Limantour Spit has moved back and forth a bit, probably. The spit on the opposite side moves back and forth. And a lot of that depends on sediment supply and the amount of sediment being flushed from these denuded hills into the bay and then worked on by currents and so on. But you might say if you came back, 120 years on, as it were, from the first image, and so on, you'd say, well, there hasn't been much change. But of course there's been change, because change is always continuous. That's why I always get somewhat irritated by people who come up to me at the golf club or tennis club and say, have you heard about climate change? What's your view? And so on. It's very irritating. But anyway, we have this kind of evidence. But that doesn't necessarily help us to understand longer term change or the nature of change. If you would say, if you compare these two images, you might say, well, the limit of a spit has advanced about 100 meters since 1859 to where it is today. I mean, that's garbage. Of course, it's closed over, it's been breached in various places, it's closed over again, and so on. So we have to take a longer term perspective. And when we do that, we have to go to the geologic evidence. We have to go to the evidence that we can generate from and then extend from things like tide gauges and wave buoys and so on. And we have to do the work ourselves. And that's kind of often the interesting thing. I just want to quickly look at the longer term changes and just take you back to the tectonic history of our planet. It's rather fascinating. I grew up at a time when I was an undergraduate, people were only then beginning to debate plate tectonics and so on, and a lot of people were opposed to it. Well, they were wrong. But in any case, just in the top left here, we have the opening of the Atlantic, which began probably, the initial eruptions were about, in the Triassic, about 250 million years ago, but it began to open significantly in the middle of Jurassic, you see there. Where was California? Well, who cares? There were kind of land masses offshore, which we have very little idea. They've been represented here kind of photographically anyway, to give the impression that they were colliding with the California coast. By the time we get to the middle of late Cretaceous, about 90 million years ago, some of them had adhered, accreted, subducted, or been lost, and so on. And this particular image doesn't show anything out there, but we know now that there were things out there. It doesn't really matter. When we come to the early Miocene, about 20 million years ago, 23 million or less, we start seeing kind of some things that we may recognize. Certainly, we start seeing kind of recognize where spreading centers might have been in the oceanic crust, where the fracture zones may have been, and so on. And it's from there that we start kind of putting together how the long-term California coast came to be. Now, long-term change is very variable. Tectonic mobility is both lateral and vertical. That causes all manner of problems when we start trying to interpret the coast. Because sea level change, if we just take the purely static element and so on that deals with the growth and decay of ocean water and so on, it is again highly variable. I've just put in some data here for the culmination of the kind of last major rise of sea level. Began probably about 25,000 years ago, but peaked between 18 and 12,000 and then taken off a bit and so on. When the rate of change was 1 to 2 centimeters a year, 10 to 20 millimeters a year, and probably greater in some places and at some times and so on. And then we come to the critical element of the last 7,000 years or so, when the rate of change has been 1/10 of that, but it's still changing. And all this has to do with a whole variety of factors which are very complex. And anybody who says they understand relative sea level change, they may understand the principles of work, but if they actually know the answer to what's going to happen, then they're talking garbage. Now, we have in the situation, of course, when we come to California, we start to embed kind of various situations. This is a rather nice map from the USGS a few years back. What we're looking at here is that part of the North American plate that was captured by the, when the Farallon plate was overrun. Farallon plate is here, by the way, in yellow, and up here in yellow, and so on. But the rest of it, when North America transferred part of it to the Pacific plate, it captured it. And that's part of our problem with respect to long-term instability. We lie now to the west for the most part until you get north of Bodega Bay. The actual coast lies to the west of the San Andreas Fault, and it creates all manner of problems. And it's a feature that's very thoroughly represented, of course, in the coastal zone. Up there you do recognize presumably Point Reyes, coming down to the Inns Lagoon and moving up to Bodega Bay and so on. Well, this is a significant element in the history of the California coast over the longer term. But when you look at that, it also becomes a matter of what has this done to our sea levels? Well, here is a picture that people will know well and so on. Driving on the kind of California 1 north of Santa Cruz, you come across a modern shore platform. Modern in the sense that it's being reworked at present by the sea, although it may be worked by past seas. And you have the modern sea cliffs. And then you look at the sea cliffs and you see here alluvial materials, and you see old beach deposits. Can't see them at this distance, of course. And back here you see the colluvium rising up against the cliffs from which the colluvium is derived. Well, we get sequences like that that tell us, all right, so sea levels changed. But why has it changed? That's the big problem. You come down to Point Loma in San Diego, and again, these are Cretaceous rock which have been trimmed rather nicely by wave action and then dumped on by old beaches and sometimes large boulders, and then colluvium again from the backing cliffs. But when we look at relative sea level change, there are all manner of issues involved. I don't know whether you can read this, I certainly can't from here, and so on. But anyway, longer term changes, of course, the global changes of sea level. Due to changes in ocean volume, changes in ocean basin capacity, both of which, of course, changes in ocean volume, of course, are very much climatically controlled at the present time by climate change and so on, and glacial growth and decay and so on. Ocean basin capacity, of course, is controlled by tectonics and also by sedimentation in the ocean floor. So all those can cause the sea level to change. Tectonism also comes to play at the kind of regional level, as this is on the California coast, and also isostasy is a factor that we've often ignored, the way in which the crust adjusts to loading and unloading by water, by sediment and so on along the coast, which is more important than is often given credit for. And then there are overall issues of geoidal changes. And over the shorter term, of course, we have all manner of kind of climate-related and weather-related features dealing with atmospheric pressure on the ocean, winds, waves, and so on, and oceanographic changes, changes in ocean density related very often to thermal forcing and so on, ocean currents, and then down here I put in tides, seas, and so on. Well, these are all things that help to explain kind of sea level change in a relative sense. But when we come to look at the evidence, then it gets a bit more complicated. This is, on the left here, we have a long established, this is the old core that was obtained from the Southwest Pacific by Shackleton and Opdyke back in around 1970. And it shows you basically how they interpreted the sedimentary record to reflect rises and falls of sea level. You'll see up here, we have the sea rising towards present levels. And one of the only things perhaps I'll note, of course, we have the low sea levels of the last glacial maximum, our previous glacial maxima, particularly the Illinois maxima here, and then earlier glaciations here. And you'll notice this is a purely eustatic curve. It doesn't take into account tectonics or other forcing factors. But you'll see that this sea level is rising here, but it is yet to reach the elevation of isotope stage, marine isotope stage 5e, which was about 125,000 years ago, when it was about, if you take the worldwide average, and you kind of ignore tectonism and so on since then it was about 6 or to 8 meters above present sea level. So when we talk of present climate change, it is just possible that this is our tomorrow, and so on. And if it is, it's a bit serious for some people, and so on. But when you try to compare this with Barbados, which is a relatively stable kind of mass of rock out there off the Caribbean, but also New Guinea, which is anything but stable, and the Santa Clemente Island, then you realize that trying to relate these features to this curve becomes a bit of an absurdity. As I say, these were things that were done back in the 1970s. And it becomes absurd because we have a coastal environment which is highly unstable for tectonic reasons. It doesn't appear overnight for the most part, sometimes it does, but for the most part it's just a cumulative effect of tectonic change going on over many thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. But you're probably all familiar with this particular scene. If you go up to the Palisera Cross in Ventura and look west, you'll see the last interglacial cliff line. You'll see a shore platform. You'll see an earlier shore platform up here, very strongly tilted. You'll see lower cliffs and shore platforms and so on. And that's what, one of the features we have to deal with in California. Now, the Ventura coast is not unique, but it is unusual in California. It's not all quite as dramatic as that. And of course, many of you were not probably born when it was used, these terraces were used for cattle stockyards in preparation for their slaughter on the Los Angeles kind of urban market. And this is rather sad. The people of Ventura soon got rid of these kind of thing because it didn't do much for their kind of tourist industry. When you go further south, I've shown here from my early work down in Baja California, I've shown you some of the evidence down there, which is there's not been much work on, but it's rather fascinating. This is in this area here, south of Ensenada, which would be up here, and before you get to San Quintin, which would be about here, and El Rosario, which would be about here. But you'll see here a series of fairly extensive marine terraces. They're well documented. These gullies, you can pick out shells out of the beach deposits, and the highest shoreline is this one, shown here. But as you trace it northwards onto the Punta Banda Peninsula, it actually rises. If you trace it southwards, it drops away. And if it goes further south towards Rosario and so on, it rises to a similar level at Punta Banda and then dips away again. And all the other terraces, to a greater or lesser extent, mainly lesser extent as they get more recent, also are tilted, warped, deformed, and so on. That's the kind of coast we're dealing with here. The interaction of sea level change relative to tectonic change. And down here you have the lowest of the last interglacial shoreline here. You'll see how it dips from probably about 40 meters above sea level in Punta Banda Peninsula, like in Ventura, and then it dips southwards, and then it disappears. It disappears alongside faults here, and disappears below sea level, and then comes out again later. All this makes interpreting the changes to the California coast very, very difficult. And if you've been down to Baja California at some stage or other, I've not been down there really since they built the road southwards and so on. But it's rather fascinating. When you look at this, now you can't possibly read this, and I apologize for that, but basically, when you take the last interglacial shoreline 125,000 years ago during marine isotope stage 5E and so on, and we trace it along the coast. I haven't put in Gary Griggs' information up here, because I didn't want to spoil his day, as it were, and so on. But from here southwards on the Big Sur coast, around Point Conception, and then past us here, and south into northern Baja California, there's all manner of kind of mischief going on. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that while sea level has been going up and down, like this, during interglacial and glacial stages and so on, the coast itself has been going up and down as well. This has been going down, relatively speaking, like this, and this has been going up and down like this. So it's very difficult to begin to interpret the sea level record if you only consider purely gooseneck effects. If you come to the more recent kind of past, it is equally troublesome. This is from Tanya Atwater's work in southern San Francisco Bay back in 1975. But what they were looking at were the marsh deposits that in fact are found beneath sea level, which kind of relate to the last stages of the post-glacial, the late Pleistocene, early Holocene transgression. Often in Europe it's called the Flandrian, after Flanders, where it's well documented in the sedimentary record. But what you often see in, this is in particular in Europe, What you often see, of course, is old peat in the intertidal zone. And they were recognized in the 16th and 17th century, and there are many old worthies who would write in their kind of naturalist journals of the time about submerged forests, and they are just there. These are oak woodlands, beech woodlands, elm woodlands to some extent, and so on, which were all living at the coast, or near the coast and so on, when the sea level began to rise. And that's what you find today sometimes. You find some wonderful examples, I mean, all over the place. There's a lot of organic stuff up there, and of course it's in the range of radiocarbon dating. But when you look at it for the world as a whole, if you take the record which Atwater and our colleagues did, here is the end of the kind of sea level rise in the Pacific Ocean, in atolls and so on, where there's been much less disturbance. If you look at it for southern San Francisco Bay, you'll see it here, and you'll see that the very rapid rise, I mean obviously take the age against the depth and so on, but a very rapid rise up until about 8,000 years ago, and then a slowing down until about 6,000 years ago, but the rise continues. If you go up to the Bolinas Lagoon and take similar cores, and of course there are all these cores are subject to errors due to age and also location and so on, but nevertheless you can draw these smooth curves through them. And this makes for a problem even in interpreting the last sea level rise. And when you get up here, and this area would be 1950, but when you go on to, say, 2017, these rates are continuing. And it becomes a very, very fascinating record. When you go to the tide gauge record, here I've just chosen to show you the tide gauge record from its inception in 4 locations. And at the same time, I just terminated this in 1970, the earlier part of the curve. You'll see that sea level has been rising in the tide gauges in San Diego significantly, in Los Angeles, that's in Los Angeles Harbor, San Pedro, and in San Francisco, off the end of Market Street kind of thing originally. And that is the longest record in California. It's a fascinating record. These are more or less the annual changes, the kind of spiky, kind of thin lines. And then the less spiky, thick lines are the 5-year running means. But they show that things are not even. Now, when we think about sea level change today, we have to think in terms of variable rates of rise from year to year for a whole range of reasons. But there's one exception here, California, and that is Crescent City. Crescent City lies beyond the Mendocino fracture zone. It lies east of the San Andreas Fault as it plunges into the Mendocino fracture zone. And that coast is rising tectonically relative to sea level. So what you have is that in Crescent City, here, sea level has been falling. Modestly, but has been falling because the land is really rising at a faster rate. And that's something to bear in mind too. If you had a substantial rate rise, that's kind of from some source or other, I obtained this record, suggestion and so on. What does 10 meters rise of sea level? Well, that's going to take a long time. That's not something we have to worry about in the immediate future, but we just have to be prepared and so on. If you had a 10-meter rise, that's 33 feet or so of sea level, it would make a bit of a mess around San Francisco Bay. It sure as hell would chew up much of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, unless more sediment came down and buried, provided a ramp against which the sea couldn't progress. But we have these interesting things we can do, and this was in, I think, in a publication that was dealing with the terrors of sea level change and so on. But if we come to the present time, medium-term change, I want to talk about that now. I want to talk about the last, within the last 10 years or so, we still have change. This is at Alama Beach, you may know that, just north of Point Conception, going around to Point Ohano, and so on. And you have shore platforms, and you have crumbling cliffs in neogene sediments, and so on. Just south of Point Sal, you have landslides coming out on the coast, like this one. This came down about 200 years ago, and so on, from what we gather. And all these effect changes in the coast, which are really quite rapid compared to what we've been looking at just now. And this is drawn from the work of Gary Briggs and numerous others kind of thing, we can actually kind of define rates of sea retreat in the kind of modern period and so on, as you can see here, the last few decades and so on. And we can define that rates of retreat sometimes are quite significant. Up here we're looking at just north of Orme, for example. And a lot of it, of course, is clouded by the fact that rock types play a significant role in whether kind of sea level makes much of an impact, sea level change sea level makes much of an impact on sea cliff retreat. So we have these kind of features and so on. Also, in the medium term, we have to deal with the addition and removal of blown sand, of alien deposits from the coastal zone. Back in the 1980s, my students and I think Julia was part of this and so on, we used to go up and look at sand dunes along the Santa Maria Basin and up at Morro Bay and so on. And from this emerged a pattern of sea level change, sea level change, but also more aeolian deposits. In here, there are kind of aeolian sands. The Orchid Formation is partly aeolian, partly fluvial. The sediments are interbedded. On top of these are the orange deposits, which are late Pleistocene dunes, generally relating to the low stand of sea level during the last glaciations. And then beyond that, we have the lighter, the ochre, or the lighter orange. Here, those are the dunes that came into existence when sea level was low before it rose during the so-called Cambrian transgression, which is represented here by the black. Now, much of the movement of the black sands, of course, is also encouraged by human activity. You get it here, for example. Much of this is not really natural in the sense of having been triggered by natural factors. More, it's been kind of an adjustment of the beginnings of wide-scale ranching and vegetation removal along the coast. When you put it together, again, you have the effects superimposed here on the last interglacial shoreline, marine limit here, slightly above present sea level there in the Santa Maria Basin. And then on top of this, we have the Orchid Formation, and we have some older dunes, and then you have the early Holocene dunes, and then they were eventually deprived of more sediment, more sand, so they began blowing downwind as parabolic dunes. On top of these are the modern dunes, transverse dunes, mainly with steep, active steep bases and so on. But the alien record is fascinating in its own right. When you look at beaches, this is a view here of Point Doom, east of here, and it shows the headland as it was in 1920. We have a collection of photographs at UCLA taken by a man who obtained a small biplane at the end of World War I and went out and started photographing Southern California. His name was Spence. The record is absolutely superb, and we have instances of the coast before it was developed. Today, of course, it's largely covered with homes and so on. But just to the west, you see beaches that are really quite significantly accreting as a result of sediment working its way down-drift from, say, the Goo area and beyond, from the rivers and so on to our west, but not to great extent. And then eventually, that sand that makes it down here disappears down offshore canyons, and so on, as it does at Point Magoo, as it does at Port Hueneme, and so on. Well, a graduate student and I, he's now with the Corps of Engineers and doing very well. We looked at a number of these beaches for his PhD kind of thing, and he published most of it himself, but we got in on this particular one. We looked at these beaches over time from the earliest photographic record. And what we did, the photographic record there, vertical photographs, goes back to 1928, which is not that much. But we looked at the width of the beach, as it was at Zuma, as it was farther west as well. And what we observed is that there were areas where the beaches were very wide, and then they were kind of very narrow, wide again, narrow again, and that's the kind of zero line for our baseline. And these variations, we realized you could fit a curve to them. not a very good curve, but nevertheless a curve that would suggest that there was some kind of something cyclic going on in terms of perhaps climate forcing and so on. And we quickly realized that in all likelihood this was due to the fluctuations of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which when it was kind of very vigorous kind of thing would result in widespread erosion and so on. And when it was more placid, would result in accretion. And this began to create a story that is kind of interesting. The medium-term climate forcing of beach dimensions. Work that should be really, I think, continued. Now, when we look at other things, waves, currents, tides, and so on, of course, we're dealing with the present for the most part. What we can study now, you can sometimes retroactively create wave climates of the past, but it's much more fun to get in the surf and look at them today. And you will probably remember this image, which is of course an early Landsat image from the 1970s. Amongst the other things it shows rather nicely are some of the great kind of alluvial fans that were washed out as a result of the 1969 floods into the Mojave Desert from the Wrightwood area. And that's kind of irrelevant to this talk. But in any case, it picks out in false color some of the nature of the surface waters. And when we look at them on the record, we might say, well, how does the wave climate respond to climate change over the shorter time? Some of the work that we've done along the Malibu coast, we did during the 1990s, early years of the present century, and we were dealing with a wave climate which is not untypical of the record over the longer term. You can see waves don't amount to very much during the period beginning with the water year in October, November, but it starts getting a bit more stormy in mid-December, and then it's often quite stormy in January, February, and early March before things taper off somewhat. Not entirely, April can be stormy at times, and so on, but the other months of the year, May through September, wave heights don't amount to a ton of these. And this is from the Santa Monica Wave Buoy at Santa Monica Bay. So wave heights is something we can kind of retroactively consider because we have records when we come to look at kind of the effects of short-term processes. And you're all familiar with this kind of thing. Some of these pictures were taken around here, and there's Anacapa and Santa Cruz in the distance, and this one and so on. The summer swells, some often far traveled, as you know. And leading, amongst other things, to fairly passive conditions along the coast, so Ventura Beach generally accretes at that time. And then you have the winter storm waves, generally from mid-December to mid-March or so, and that can be much more serious. And here you see, of course, the uncovering of the beach sand removal during the winter months, again at Ventura. You can have, of course, interfering with this whole pattern, you have rip currents. Here, looking from the cliffs above the Torrey Pines, you see some rip currents, not much in the way of kind of sediment transport in these by the lagoon, but anyway, you can see them there, and you can see the mouth of your own Santa Clara River nearby. I know that Linda O'Hara studied this in some depth, and we'll come back to that in a moment. We have the tidal range. We can deal with the tidal record and look at the effects of that. Now, we don't have big tides along the west coast, not the kind of tides. When I grew up in southwest England, the tidal range on the north coast of Cornwall and Devon, Somerset, was about 10 to 15 meters twice a day. And that was significant. And then in spring tides, it was as much as 20 meters twice a day. And they used to call them St. Mary's floods for apparent reason. But in any case, if you're out on the foreshore at low tide, you had to start running to get to the safety behind the harbour wall at high tide, because the tide was coming in faster than the average, certainly the average person can really run. So that was a significant thing. Now here we only have roughly a 2 meter tidal range, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. The kind of smudgy nature of this particular image relates to the kind of the difference between, well, The light one is between higher high water and lower low water, and then in between that we have higher low water and lower high water. And if you're not confused, don't worry about it. So, but the effect is that, you know, in areas of wetland, particularly, let's say in the Chara Delta and Morro Bay and so on, you can actually see the difference, and this has all manner of ecological significance as well as some kind of physical significance as well. So all this affects change to the coast. If you go into lagoons, I believe this lagoon on the coast, this is from the USGS publication some years back and so on. Tides, of course, despite their modest kind of range, nevertheless, if they get trapped into inlets and lagoons, they can actually generate forces that are in excess of what one expects, say, on the open coast. You get these tidal currents which at their maximum exceed 50 meters per second. That's capable of moving quite a lot of sand and so on. If you get to the Santa Clara River now, of course, something that this is a seasonal thing. It can happen several times a season. Here are pictures I took back in 1998. You'll see here, sorry. See here how the mouth has been completely breached. Sediment has been flushed out onto the shelf, kind of thing, and the record on the shelf is a fascinating one. There are probably people who are working on it today, working out things like fire recurrence intervals under fairly natural conditions and so on. Well, 6 months later, of course, the mouth was closed. You see this particular wave here coming from the southwest. These will be southerly waves being refracted and so on, coming in and pushing this spit northwards until it kind of pounded against one of the breakwaters they have up here and so on. But you have a very dynamic environment responding, as it were, within months to changing forcing factors. I want to take you now in a little more detail to areas again that you probably know quite well. The river mouth of Malibu Creek. Now, Malibu Creek is not much of a stream, and it's been much interfered with in its upper reaches by human activity, suburban development, and by damming in its lower reaches. It differs along its reaches, and so on. But it's a rather interesting laboratory which to study river mouth dynamics. We're dealing here with currents in meters per second. We're dealing with changes in the coast measured in minutes, hours, and days, and so on. Now, during the El Nino event of 1998, we happened to be working up there anyway, and we realized we had a significant event on, and you'll see here beginning in October, rainfall, and of course it peaked here in February 1998 with enormous amounts of rain. This happened to coincide with high discharge, the fine line there, and then the thicker line is the wave height thing. So you have all these forcing factors at work, and by the time the following summer came around, of course these forces had largely dissipated. But for a short time in winter, it was pretty serious. So we look at what happened. February 1998, the whole river mouth opened. Here you have some river mouth bars, laid down, longitudinal bars laid down by outflowing waters. And here you have sediment being slowly reworked, more or less almost simultaneously, by wave processes at the coast. When you look at it in terms of the dynamics of the river mouth, this is just Malibu Creek, something you can deal with quite handily. Anything on this map here, this is October 87, this is a closed river mouth. You may be down there, during that time. It's a very popular destination for swimmers and surfers and so on. And this is kind of changing shade is about 1 meter. And so you can see during the end of summer kind of thing, the barrier is complete. It first breached in December, so we mapped it again. It breached more widely in February and was completely gone in March. And then we watched it in March. By then, February, we had these longitudinal bars in here, river bars kind of thing, with the current and so on. But by March, sand was beginning to be reorganized along the coast in here. So the next series show this, the reconstruction of the bar. What happens, it's not simply a matter of littoral drift or sand moving along the coast. It's a matter of sand moving obliquely, even crabwise, against the coast. So that here you begin to see intertidal kind of growth of sand, isolated little islands here. And then by June, things are getting quite calm. This sand is beginning to gain height, but there are still outlets because there's a lot of rain during the preceding winter, and again here and so on. And then in July, it was moving very much, the barrier was moving right across the river mouth. And then here, it has arisen 2 meters at least above its previous levels. All this was due to the crab-like staggered movement of sand being brought down in the previous winter, offshore and then reworked on shore. And what you see here is moving across the river mouth, and that's the way it is. And then it builds up, and the supply of sand from the river and the supply of sand offshore is curtailed because there's just no sand left. So the lagoon behind builds up, and it reaches in the lowest point, which is down here. Lowest point because this is the area from which sand has been removed, whereas in here it's still moving along the coast. And that's something that puzzled me for ages. I've looked at a lot of African rivers, and I did a lot of work in Africa with the US Navy in the 70s and 80s and thing. And I was always puzzled by the fact that the mouths of many rivers, seasonal rivers, were blocked by spits or barriers, if you like, and so on. But often they were oriented contrary to the direction of the prevailing littoral drift. And in doing this study, I came to realize quite quickly that from more or less day to day, we saw this happening and why it happened. And therefore you end up here in August 1998 with a substantial barrier. And if you went down there and just took one aerial photograph and simply said, oh, this route must be from the east. In other words, from this way. No, it's not. It's still from the west, from the southwest and so on. Those winter bars, river bars are still there. But the barrier itself, in fact, has been breached at its weakest point. Not anything to do with the littoral drift. And then, work in which I've been involved, and my wife Amy has been involved. Again, I think that's Amy there, I'm not sure. But you've got an older rod. Anyway, we had an experiment, in my case, it began in the 1970s at Point Magoo Naval Air Station, and we built a groin out into the surf zone, beyond the surf zone, so that we could measure littoral processes over time. And this was quite an effective study. It was commissioned by the Coastal Engineering Research Center. And it revealed, amongst other things, things that we could actually identify offshore bars and troughs, which you see here, and so on. And then moving on shore, here over a 11-day period, moving on shore and welding to the beach face. When you look at it over kind of space and time, look at a single bar. And what we have here is sometime after the inception of erosion due to plunging breakers, we have a bar left behind as a trough is excavated by steep plunging breakers down here and so on. And the bar trough sequence is generated. And then over time, the bar moves landward, I think it's a case of a couple of weeks, and the trough also moves landwards, and then they adhere to the cliff face. So we have these very interesting patterns occurring, again in a matter of minutes and days. And from this, you can begin to kind of estimate rates of movement, rates of movement of onshore migration of longshore bars. And I got very variable rates because I studied several of them. Other people have got similar rates. In North Carolina, USGS is going to facility there, and so on, and some of them quite modest reefs, and some of these are in lakes, Michigan, for example. But this is a highly variable thing. There's nothing you can actually predict by just looking at one bar and come to some general conclusion. Now, lastly, I just want to talk a little about management challenges along the coast. This is an old map, not a dirt map, don't worry about that. What is interesting is the pressure on the coast. As you can see, in 1850, there weren't very many people around. The urban population concentrated anywhere, and so on, mainly in the Bay Area, was really quite small, a few percent, and so on. By 1950 rather, about half the population was urban, and was getting concentrated along the coast, and that has simply increased since. Well, what this creates is, from the perspective of temporal impacts on the coast, it creates a very wild and woolly scenario related to human impacts and the role of humans in modifying the coast. So this is what we're looking at here. Sometimes you can't but ponder human stupidity. The Oxnard Shores, I don't know whether you've been there, down there. Today, I think, last time I was down there, a year or two ago, the beach was very wide. But in 1971, the beach was in the harbour. So you see here. And most of these houses were destroyed. But they got permission to build again. Absolutely stupid. This person, of course, lost guests quite frequently when they refused to come to his patio parties. This was eventually collapsed onto the shore. This is just west of Santa Barbara. And these are some of the features of poor decisions being made by human beings along the coast. And it seems as though the wealthier you are, the more stupid you become. Whoops. And here we have a house that simply, during the Northridge earthquake, nothing to do specifically with the sea, but during the Northridge earthquake, houses just north of Santa Barbara on the Pacific Coast Highway, they simply collapsed and eventually came down here and so on. You have this situation down here. This is Big Rock Mesa, between Malibu and Santa Monica. Well, in 1930, when a few of these houses were built, nobody told them, because nobody knew at the time, that this was a landslide scar. And in 1980, after several years of rather heavy rain, 1969, 1978, 1980, this whole mass began moving again. And many of these houses crumpled, some of them fell over on the Pacific Coast Highway. It not only started moving, but it started rotating. So that rocks similar to the rocks in this kind of cliff here were coming up offshore as reefs and being trimmed by the waves. And so obviously this is not the kind of thing you should do. One should plan ahead, one should see what one's dealing with, and not plant one's sea view houses in city places. And of course there are other things that have gone on. You've probably seen this. Summerland, east of Santa Barbara, during the initial years of offshore exploration. Well, stuff. And of course there are those where analysis will tend to cover our mistakes and so on, like here in the Long Beach Harbor. This is now, I think, largely built up, but this was a picture I took back in the early 1970s, and if you know English comedy TV kind of thing, here's Hyacinth kind of thing, with her hat, oops, kind of thing, sitting admiring human folly, or human establishment. It depends where you are, but whether you're Republican or Democrat, I suppose. And so with her poor husband who doesn't know about solar radiation. But in any case, we have this situation along the coast. And then you get other situations on the coast. Here, just north of Pismo Beach, Shell Beach kind of thing, band-aid approaches to protecting properties. And we see that here with the concrete sandbags and so on, and properties that come and go. This one I was kind of mused about because of its desire. When development began along the Malibu coast, the beach was about 100 meters wide, and it was thick and so on, and people built on the back shore. Well, that kind of situation doesn't prevail. After a while, of course, particularly the effects of reduced sediment yield to the coast, you start losing your beach. Then the houses themselves interfere with sediment transport, and you have to rebuild your structure. Of course, rather than take any notice of what's going on, you put the houses on pilings, and this is what happens. This person probably had some sense, and as much as he has a little dinghy outside his bedroom, he can really get bad. And of course, mass movement continues. This happened back in 1980, big rock slide thing, and I remember at the time I was called in by the state to evaluate the what to do, and I was also met the owners, and this was in 1980. That means anything to you today, but that's when a lot of American citizens and others were trapped inside Iran and so on. And it so happened that the owners of this land were the Persian rug sellers, and they were immediately slapped with multi-million-dollar fines for letting the cliffs collapse. And it wasn't their fault. They were long-established kind of residents of this country kind of thing. They happened to have bought the land and so on. They didn't realize it was unstable, but it was unstable in part because the base of the cliff had been removed to widen the Pacific Coast Highway. So I just told them to write back, through their attorneys, write back to the state and say, don't be bloody silly, and so on. You caused this. We were passive survivors, and we ought to be suing you. And of course, the decision went away. Of course, there are along this coast again, West of Ventura here, and so on, attempts to band-aid the coast again, and it doesn't always work. Or put up groins. Groins are effective, but they're a two-edged sword. Groins may temporarily slow littoral drift, but they cause all manner of havoc downdrift where there's no sediment supplying the beaches, so you get that. But building a groin, particularly a steel groin like this, is no small task. This was our experimental groin at Point Magoo, near Point Magoo, which was not known to the public because it was in the Point Magoo Naval Air Station territory. And you can, of course, this is a picture taken at the mouth some years later, the Ventura Marina, just an example of something that you really shouldn't do, build a marina at the mouth of a unreliable river. 69, the Santa Clara River came down and swept the marina away. And so on. Well, not to be outdone, the engineers came back and they decided, well, we can beat that, and so on. And so far they have, I suppose. They started building more structures. Shore-connected breakables were already there, just here and here. They didn't do much good in 1969, but they added a bit more here. They added a kink to the end of the offshore breakwater there. They have another breakwater up here, and that's very often the way how coastal erosion problems or coastal hazard problems are resolved by people who really should know better. They start trying to build a way out of trouble, and they dredge and dredge. And you've probably seen these in operations in Ventura Marina and so on, spilling the goo from the mound that accumulates off the mouth of the marina and so on, and then pumping it out drift, where it eventually makes its way to the Santa Clara River mouth, and then farther down and so on. Sometimes you can get it right. I must give the Corps engineers their merit here. Ventura Marina was built by local interests with no prior research whatsoever. Knowing that, Corps engineers, the Coastal Engineering Research Centre, decided that they better do things right this time, and that's what they did. The Channel Islands Harbour, again, it's a view some years ago before the harbour was completely filled in with the development and so on. But they built two lengthy kind of parallel jetties here out from the shore, and they built a very long offshore breakwater, offset updrift, so that it accumulates sediment in here, and they could pump it back downdrift. And this is some of the sediment here being moved, pumped downdrift, and then moved back on shore as a kind of berm. Now sometimes it's all right, that's right. But there's another problem with the coastal zone, and that is the variable supply of sediment to the coast today. This is Ringe Dam in the Santa Monica Mountains, built by Adore Farms, the dairying enterprise, in 1920 to provide a constant, regular water supply to the dairy downstream, and of course within 10 years it was completely filled in with cement. And it's still a problem, and they still haven't taken it down. And mainly because all manner of fat cats lived in the stream, and they fear the results of taking it down. People like Mel Gibson have been particularly, he lives in Malibu within a rifle shot of this dam and so on. And he's very upset. So, well, bad luck. I just want to finish just briefly by saying that as a gemologist, I've been asked to do many things in terms of coastal management and planning over the years. I've been asked to advise, for example, when certain Donald Trump wanted to build a golf course in Palos Verdes Peninsula. I was asked for my opinion by the Coastal Commission, and I said, well, I know some of those areas. I got that. I received the plans. I know that the 9th hole. This was the time of the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was threatening the mother of all battles. And I said, you're going to have the mother of all landslides there. But the Coastal Commission chose to ignore it for reasons that I shouldn't go into, but you can gather if Trump's involved, he would get his way, and so on. The upshot of all this was that in 5 years' time, they had the mother of all landslides and so on. I always try to apply basic principles to understanding the coast. Now, this is not the open coast, this is Lake Tahoe, and it's this bucolic scene kind of thing, the Beverly Valley looking northwest kind of thing, captures what is still an idyllic situation, not quite as idyllic as it used to be. But I was asked to come in and review the situation in the lake in the early 70s with a view to perhaps recommending where the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency should go with its attempts to control development and protect the shoreline. And what I did, of course, is I went out first and started looking at the nature of the shore, kind of thing. I measured the currents, sediment transport, and so on. And I came up with this simple map, which kind of helped at the time. And from this, I also defined the existing state of the shoreline in terms of whether it was stable or whether it was eroding or depositing. And there was some kind of accretion down here when the upper Truckee River runs into the lake. There are large areas of fairly stable shoreline along the Nevada shore here because it's granite. It doesn't kind of move very much on the reactions that you get at Tahoe. And then there were some areas that were pretty kind of unstable, mainly on glacial, also still on the California shore. And from that I defined shore zone types from Lake Tahoe and came up with a whole series of, as you can see, about a dozen or so types of shoreline, which should all be managed in different ways. And from that, I went eventually to produce a shore zone capability map, and this became the basis for the shore zone plan of Lake Tahoe, which is still the guiding document, I'm told, up there, with respect to how to go about looking at the coast and managing it. And amongst other things, I suggested 200-foot setbacks along the coast to prevent developments that were threatening homeowners and people on recreation and so on up there. That was winnowed down by the lawyers, of course, particularly the Nevada lawyers who didn't like the idea of having 200 feet zone taken away from them. But anyway, it was winnowed down to 100 feet, but it still prevails. So that's my look at the coast and so on, the changing coast. And it's a bit bucolic and so on, say in French films, and so on, and that's the way it is.
somebody else?
No, no, I was just looking.
Okay. I was just wondering, did you say that the wave heights, like the wave climate and stuff like that, is that short term or is that medium term change?
No, we use the term wave climate to describe the longer term nature of wave action. Climate, as distinct from weather, it tends to be an average of over a period of years. The World Meteorological Organization used 30 years as a limit for climate. And they do running means, 30 years, 30 years, 30 years, and 30 years. And from these you get trends. Well, with waves we do the same. The wave climate is something that is an average observed over a period of time. It doesn't have to be 30 years. But it has to be more than just the result of an overnight storm. And so on. So it's a matter of several years using wave buoys and so on, and taking those data and putting them together into some kind of pattern that is may have climate implications.
Okay, so you would say that would be falling under medium term change then?
Medium
Okay.
in that respect, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Does the water temperature, its density and salinity from the river mouths affect the tidal flows of the oceans?
This water,
Does the water density, salinity, and temperature from the river mouth affect the tidal flows?
yes. Well, yes. I mean, river mouths are areas of competition between outflowing fresh water and inflowing salt water. So in an ideal situation, you might have the fresh water coming in over a salt pitch and so on. It's often not as simple as that. Sometimes the fresh water will actually flush everything out, and flush the salt water out too. I've been in many big river mouths in Africa where you can see, you can pick up fresh water, 10 miles offshore and so on. In other instances, particularly when river flows are limited, you can have the tidal flows, particularly if you have a big tidal range coming in and creating havoc in another direction. Big examples of that are some of the bores you have in some, apart from me, the bores that you have in river mouths that have large tidal ranges, like the Bay of Fundy, and also particularly the one I'm more familiar with, the Bristol Channel, and so on. I don't know how many of you watch Doc Martin and so on, but the opening scenes are often in a little place called Port Isaac, which in the film, in the TV series, they call Port Wales. It's on the north coast of Cornwall, towards the mouth of the Bristol Channel. When you actually next look at it, or if you don't, it's on Thursday night at 8. So, when you next look at it, you'll see that sometimes the water is high up the jetty, and sometimes the whole little harbour mouth is exposed, and so on. Well, that's roughly about a 15 metre tidal range. When that happens, when that tide, and it changes every, from low to high, 6.5 hours or so, 6.25 hours or so, when that tide is on the flood, it moves up the Bristol Channel, which is the offshore channel between southwest England and Wales, at a galloping speed, and it gets compressed into the narrows of north of Bristol towards Gloucester, and when it's checked, of course, it starts spreading out on either side, as we all expect, and so on. And eventually, it subsides and everything flushes back out very quickly. And when that happens, down goes all the fresh water, and down goes all it's a wet climate anyway. So there's plenty of fresh water coming down, but it takes out the salt water again. It depends where you are, but yes, there's a lot of interaction between fresh and salt water. This has significant ecological implications as well.
At the very start, you were talking about how it's practically impossible to say how much the sea level has actually risen and how it will affect everything, and that was because the ocean depth is always changing, and then the height of the coastlines are also changing. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the long-term picture.
Yeah, long term.
We anticipate when there's movement along the California coast now, it's tectonic movement and so on. But it's a millimetre or so. It doesn't compare with the effects of, say, a single tide, which is up to 2 meters or so, almost 2.5 meters. It doesn't, in other words, at on the short term processes will exceed the long term processes in the cliffs. But when you take the long term, the coast is continuing to rise or fall. And I mentioned mainly rising coast lines. Of course, all of California coast floors have some where there's actually subsidence going on. Portions of San Andreas Fault in Northern California, probably here in the Oxnard Plain, for a variety of reasons, but as I said, the plain is there, therefore some subsidence will probably exceed. In Los Angeles Harbor areas, that Beaver Harbor, because of oil extraction and so on, in the past, there are substantial subsidence and so on. In Baja California, where I was working there, you can see the effects of subsidence. And so the other effect is sometimes is rather rapid changes, tectonic changes. When I was working in Malibu, I decided I would paper and so I came across salt marsh deposits with basically they were a meter above present high water. And that was in the inner part of the lowland, north of the bridge over the Sagos Highway and so on. I dated this. And I wasn't sure, but I felt there was more likelihood there had been massive uplift here. I dated it was 1,000 years ago. So at the time the Vikings were refugee in Northwest Europe and so on. The Malibu coast fault fractured in a big way. And of course it fractured again slightly in the 1971 earthquake, the Atlanta earthquake, and again in 1994 during the Northwest earthquake and so on. So the hot water bubbled to the surface and so on, off Point Lagoon. But the big break, I think, was 1,000 years earlier at Malibu. And that Malibu coast fault, of course, is a continuation of faults that extend inland at Pasadena and eventually to Malibu fault and so on. It's the whole south side of the Santa Monica Mountains and their eastward continuation, San Diego Mountains, where the Baja California plate is pushing against and under the mountains. So, one can anticipate the other environment there. But one can anticipate from time to time it may show a bit. Yes.
I know that you mentioned tsunamis in there, and I was just curious about what kind of setbacks do the big waves.
Oh yeah, well, tsunamis, yes. I didn't mention it. Tsunamis, of course, they do impact this coast periodically. During the 1964 Alaska earthquake, of course, a tsunami train worked its way down the Pacific coast of North America, and it came into Crescent City and took boats out of the harbour and pushed them up the main street. That we do know. There's never been much of a tsunami effect here because we're sheltered somewhat from the North Pacific earthquakes. We're not sheltered so much from the Hawaii earthquakes, but there have been kind of tsunami effects here. Tsunamis essentially are shallow water waves. They have such long wavelengths, kind of thing. And of course they move on shore kind of really quite rapidly, but they feel bottom. Like all waves, of course, once they feel bottom, they start deforming. And once they start deforming, they start steepening and so on, narrowing in their crests, etc., across the shelf. But tsunami will do this far out, and therefore you get these very big waves being generated. So of course they can have a very significant impact on the coastline. I'm sorry I didn't mention it. Yes, I've seen tsunami deposits, but I've never seen a real tsunami. But I know.
If you want to.
Have you?
No, I lived in Hawaii, so we always had tsunami drills. And of course my Big Island friends, they recall Hilo's tsunami of 41.
Yes.
And of course Banda Aceh in 2004, and the Fukushima recent one too.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Oh, they're quite shocking things when they occur. And these are things that one has to prepare for. Whatever you believe about I don't mean you personally, but whatever we believe about climate change and sea level change, the thing is to acknowledge that these are possibilities, probably probabilities, and to prepare accordingly. So you don't build on top of silly kind of cliffs. You don't build, on the foreshore. and without acknowledging that it is a foreshore. That's what happened at Oxnard Shores down here.
Mhm.
Yeah, a lot of the building took place on the foreshore when the beaches were wide in the 60s.
Yeah. I'm most curious about the Juan de Fuca fault up in Cascadian and that particular fault line.
At where?
The Juan de Fuca fault up in the Cascadian.
Oh yes, yes.
That one promises to be interesting.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. Well, there have been big tsunamis up there. I mean, the one that devastated much of the Puget Lowland in 1700 was triggered, we know now, because of the records the Japanese kept, triggered by a big tsunami that was generated off Honshu and so on. Came across the North Pacific and slammed into the, it was narrowed and slammed into the kind of Puget Lowland or Puget Sound. So interesting stuff. Yeah.
So, like, we've heard like a lot of models, I think, especially from people about what the climate's doing, what the Earth and geology's doing, waves and things like this. But do you know if there's been predictions on how the communities and states and governments and people like that are going to respond, as these impacts all sort of take place? Like, once the sea level's risen, all these homes have been washed out.
Yeah.
Are people making predictions on because a lot of these, like we were mentioning, are really wealthy communities, a lot wealthier than a lot of these nearby inland neighborhoods that might be a little bit nicer or closer to the beach, or people, or you, or anything that's looking what's going to happen once these things happen. How are we going to respond to it? Not how we should, but
I would say 50, 60 years ago, I came to the United States in 1968, there was virtually no coastal planning as such. There were management procedures, and the engineers in particular were leading that with respect to, I don't put engineers down because some of them are engineers, but basically the belief was at that time, and I certainly felt this in the Corps of Engineers and Coastal Engineering Research Institute, which used to be the Beach Erosion Board, created in 1930, I feel that we can engineer our way out of trouble. And that was the prevailing belief. That's partly why changes to that philosophy, why we did these studies out of at the Naval Air Station on the coast. As a result of a succession of seismic events and major storms, including things elsewhere like Hurricane Katrina and so on, all local agencies and state agencies along coasts are now supposed to be prepared or to have prepared plans for emergency evacuation or for monitoring kind of growth and development to minimize danger. Oregon has done quite a lot of work in that respect. Up there you'll see the signs saying, tsunami evacuations of tsunami evacuation route, because they have a coast that is right out into the Pacific. So there is movement, but of course, it depends in part on money. So you have people who have plans, you need to pay them, I suppose, to some extent. The people who are paid to do this kind of thing often don't do a very good job. So it's an ongoing hassle, a struggle really, to get kind of government and politicians to respond. And no sooner do they respond to one emergency than there's another one. Their minds are taken off it and so on. So yes, there's progress being made over the last 50, 60 years, certainly I would say that. There's been very good people working on coastal management and so on. But it's not finished. It needs to be moving forward. I got involved in coastal planning originally in the city of Dublin, Ireland, and so on. That was kind of interesting. I never heard of such a thing, but they had quite a number of serious disasters in a thinly populated country, but around the city of Dublin, as a result of floods and storms and so on. And they felt very recently about this. And I was involved in the Netherlands, where they obviously have continuing problems, and they're sinking slowly into the North Sea. And so they're very good at it.
the extremes.
And wherever you know, anywhere in the world, you often call down. It used to be said in the 19th century in sort of steamships, you could call down into the boiler room and say, "Hey, Jock," a Scottish, engineer would come up. Well, the rest of the world, if you call to Hans or whatever his name is, the Dutchman will come up and will be engaged in monitoring the coast. The Dutch have done a very good job, but of course it's a bit of a losing task now. I mean, you're doing it all the time so hard, and eventually you have to move inland. Well, the Dutch don't have very many places to move inland. So, it is very interesting. These are areas that young people should get involved in. I do think that, and wonderful opportunities, I would think. But yeah, you talk to Kiki and Linda about this, they probably know. And you may know more about what's happening locally than I do any longer. I mean, I can't think of Yes?
Do you, over the last rain event, do you know if anything has happened with that sandbar in Malibu? If it got pushed out, or is there anything since then? Or just anything with that big rain event after the drought we've been having and just the heavy rain that
I
saturated
don't
it?
go down on a regular basis and check. From time to time I get called in by local homeowners, or I get called in by the state or the coastal commission and so on to look at things. They flounder along. There's a lot of kind of humming and hawing, shouting, and you go to these meetings kind of thing, and try to present a case. But a lot of people are very much self-engrossed with their own problems. So I don't tend to get too involved in those kind of things. I've been asked, but I haven't done too much. And I haven't kept an eye on Malibu. I mean, I found myself on the mailing list of the Surfrider Foundation. Now, this is a noble foundation, but they were burying me with stuff, kind of thing. So in the end, I stopped replying. So, it's all very well. I mean, I know Gary Griggs was surfing before class. This time we were used to, and so on. I've never surfed very much except off the Cornish coast. I wasn't very good at it. But nevertheless, it was, getting involved with the public is a real problem. One should. That's what our job is as environmental scientists, to try and convey information and to help society as a whole. But most local agencies often have limited funds to do the right thing, and the last thing they want to do, of course, is take on the rich homeowners. I mean, that development at Malibu, the Malibu colony, one film star after another, all sitting on the foreshore in their opulent mansions and so on, should never have been allowed to begin with. When I came in and wrote a plan for Malibu back in the 1990s, early 2000s kind of thing, with respect to how they should address the flood, sea level, and river flood hazard and so on, I recommended that they close everything, every property, including a couple of supermarkets, that lay between Malibu Creek and the main north-south road that goes inland from Pacific Coast Highway. You should have heard the noise. The howls about it yesterday. He wants to do what? Oh, my dead body. So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that note, actually, one of the big headlines we're hearing right now is that we'll lose beaches like in mass quantities by 2100. Just wondering now, in light of what you just said and the uncertainties associated, if that's garbage.
It's not exactly garbage. You have to qualify it always. We've lost a lot of sand along our coast, and it's not been replaced because we've dammed a lot of our rivers. If we were to empty some of those dams and so on, take them down and let the water flow naturally, we'd upset a lot of kind of landowners on the way to the sea, but we'd bring down more sediment, and that would be useful. That would be useful. We're not doing that. The sediment is not reaching it the way it was. But modest storms are often quite useful, in as much as the storms may bring down some, like in the Santa Clara River, for example. they may bring down landslide debris from the lower part of the watershed. They probably don't bring down quite as much from the upper part of the watershed as they used to because of the dams in the upper tributaries and so on. But those sediments come down and they replenish the coastal zone. And I'm optimistic. I believe from my work, for example, on bar and trough migration, that very often after any major storm, like we had this year in February, for example, storms, that there will be sediment brought down and it'll be dumped offshore. And then over the months ahead, people can wait that long, a lot of it will work its way back onshore. The problem with the kind of Oxnard Shores area generally, the Oxnard Plain, is that you've got these big submarine canyons offshore, and only a small portion of the sediment actually seems to get round them. I know people differ about this, and as some gets round, that which is moving along the beach face gets round, but a lot of it gets lost into Hueneme Canyon and Magoo Canyon, and if it gets beyond that, it won't get round Point Magoo very easily. The actual beaches eastwards from Magoo to Doom thing are diminishing in size, except where they truck in sand and so on. And they don't get round Point Doom. If they get into Santa Monica Bay in the strict sense, narrow sense of the word, the sediment gets pushed out by the great mass of sediment that has accumulated in the past, before roughly 1810, accumulated off the former Los Angeles River. That creates a big subaqueous delta down there off the coast, roughly off where Los Angeles International Airport is. That serves as its own groin. That shoves a lot of sediment off the edge of the subtidal delta, and it pushes it up into Santa Monica Canyon. When it picks up some of the sand from the delta itself, or other stuff coming down just occasionally, mainly trash coming down the creeks into Santa Monica Bay, that gets flushed into Redondo Canyon and so on. And they're not going away in a hurry because they are there, and they've been formed in part by runoff in the past, and certainly by a variety of marine and terrestrial forces. I think, I don't panic about the loss of beach sand, but we're obviously acquiring less sand at the beach than we would have under natural conditions. Yeah.
When you were doing your river mouth studies and seeing the breaching in regular rain years, that wasn't big storm year, did you see that it still had that little bit of a break in the weak spot, or is that something that was only because there was still enough water to push through?
Well, when a barrier forms across the river now, I've seen this a lot, I've seen it now, of course, I've seen it here and somewhere, I've seen it in Everett, lot and so on. Eventually the water will, the fluvial runoff, watershed runoff, will build up behind it. And then quite naturally it will just seek to get to the lowest point. The lowest point is often where the resupply of sand is at the medium. And that's what happened at Malibu. And that little study, in fact, demonstrated that better than anything I've seen and so on. I worked a lot along the entire Mozambique coast in Africa. And I was very interested in their very seasonal rivers because the rains there come in summer, dead summer, and so on. But a lot of sediment comes down from precious seepage, great acres of sand offshore. But eventually they close over. And 9 out of 10 of them close over with the outlet of the south side, and all the currents there, all the wave-induced currents, are coming from south to north, from the deep Southern Ocean. And so they should not close to the south end, but they do, because once the water is closed off, it's no longer the river water is closed off, it's no longer shedding sediment into the ocean for reworking. So that's what happens.
Well, we can continue the discussion. We're going to have dinner at Tortillas, and you're welcome to come if you would like. If you'd like to chat more with Tony about cultural processes. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Some interesting questions.
Yeah, just so you